Hey, we're live at the Grayzone. Welcome, everybody. We right now have Jim Fergie Chambers with us. I'll let him introduce himself. He's speaking to us from the territory of the Russian Federation. He's just been in the Donbas region, and we're hoping to get Russell Texas Bentley on as a returning guest. Right now, he's in the Donetsk People's Republic, which has a very different Wi-Fi situation. My understanding is that Zoom is sanctioning them, so they're not able to access Zoom, and it may be the same with StreamYard. I see him kind of coming into the studio, but we're unable to get a video reception with him. But Jim Fergie Chambers has been rolling with Texas around the Donbas region all the way into Mariupol. They've been on the front lines. He's been conducting some excellent interviews with local people, giving voice to people who've been completely ignored in Western media. I'm going to try to get Texas in the stream again, but it's not working out, apparently. I see him just kind of loading there. Fergie, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell our audience who you are and why you went to Donetsk and beyond.
So I am a sort of part journalist, part activist. I'm a communist from New York originally, though I've lived kind of all over the states. And I've had a connection to Russia for a long time. I lived here in St. Petersburg, where I am now, or as we would like to call it, Leningrad, years ago. And I was actually in Europe when things started to unfold with the U.S. saying Russia was going to invade, and then the beginning of the special operation, which is a really interesting set of circumstances. How that all happened day by day. I don't know if we'll go into that or not, but once I saw kind of the outpouring of Ukrainian flags on social media, the immediate block of all the Russian side, the sanctions. It occurred to me that it was extremely important that as many people from the West who could get out to Donbas and talk about that side of the conflict, as many should. And I speak Russian. I have some resources because I happen to come from a family of American media oligarchs. I use that word intentionally because we only use it for Russians.
Which family is that? I see you identify as a class traitor in your Twitter bio.
I come from the Cox family.
Okay.
We own an awful lot of media, newspapers, radio. I have nothing to do with the company other than in things like family trusts. But I'm open about this because it influences where I came to politically. But so having these resources, having the time to be able to get out there and having enough understanding of the culture and some friends and family here, I knew it would be feasible. And I think the most disturbing thing was to see people kind of have this assumption that Putin woke up one day in February and decided he wanted to invade Ukraine, as if there was no context. And so this is why specifically Donbas was the most important place to go to, because this is a people who have been under siege for 8 years.
Right.
So this was the motivation. And initially I was actually in Moldova for about a month waiting for a visa and reporting a little bit on the refugee situation there, as well as some of the simmering conflicts in Pridnestrovia or Transnistria, the separatist republic in Moldova. But yeah, I made it into Donbas about a month ago. I've been treated very well by Russian authorities and border guards the whole time, despite State Department warnings that Americans may be targeted. And I just got back out to Russia because I need to go see my kids for a little bit before I go back to Donetsk. But that's, yeah.
Okay. We were talking a little bit before the stream about some of your preconceptions coming into Donetsk and going towards the front line. Tell our viewers how they might have changed once you actually got on the ground.
So look, I've been a strong critic of U.S. imperialism and foreign policy for many years. So I definitely assumed that what we were hearing about the people's struggle in DPR and LPR, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, that these things were true. And I assumed, because I've followed it for 8 years now, that this notion of the spread of fascism and Nazism in Ukraine, in post-Maidan Ukraine, was a real problem. Of course, I was kind of open to whatever I witnessed myself when I got there, and I was surprised because the extent of both the frequency and the heaviness of the shelling of civilians in Donetsk was even more than I could have imagined. I think the first shelling of a marketplace in a residential neighborhood happened about 8 hours after I got into Donbas. And then this thing about Nazism, it's really not a niche problem. It's not a few guys in a corner. It's incredibly widespread, and the people in Donbas, but also in Melitopol and Mariupol, where I was, which are territories that were previously controlled by Ukraine and are now controlled by the Russian army, and are sort of building governments slowly and tentatively. The way that these people talked about how this problem spread, the physical evidence that we saw of this,
Yeah.
it really stunned me. I mean, it's there's no separation, between the powers in Kiev and what's going on the far right, and this kind of new Ukrainian nationalist culture is a terrifying thing to witness and to hear about from people who were living and through it and dealing with it. Some people who I talked to there, some people who I spoke to on the western side of the borders in Eastern Europe who had fled Ukraine, so other leftists that had left because they feared for their life.
Right. Right. Well, let's talk about one of your reports relating to this subject of neo-Nazism and the extremist battalions in Ukraine. And for those who are just tuning in, Russell, Texas Bentley is unable to get Wi-Fi from Donetsk, maybe because of sanctions, but we're going to try to get him on later. So you're here with Fergie Chambers. People were wanting to know if you had been in the Black Eyed Peas and had experienced a sudden appearance change, but that's not the case. Now you managed to tour.
I used to get the Duchess of York back in the 90s, and then it switched to the pop singer. So
yeah. I don't know which one I'd rather be compared to, but people in my generation, and they approach me in supermarkets and bars and whatnot and say, I look like Steve from 90210 or some guy from Homeland, but my name is mostly a popular dog name. So you toured a dungeon of the Aidar Battalion, which is one of the battalions, like the notorious Azov Battalion, funded by Igor Kolomoisky, consisting of many neo-Nazis. It was a meat plant turned a Ukrainian neo-Nazi base and prison. Well, here's the outside. You got there on the 4th of May.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And here's some of the photos you took. Idar written in graffiti on the walls of what was the barracks area of the converted plant. Here's someone from the Lugansk People's Militia who is a prisoner. And this is the space they shared. It doesn't look like a very pleasant or remotely humane situation. It looks to me like torture. You said
two people at a time in that space.
They're fed through the grates in the ceiling. This is in Zelensky's Great Democracy, and these are walls where bullets were fired just past prisoners to make them believe they were being executed. I'm just going to go through the picture.
A la Dostoevsky mock executions. Yeah.
Here's some swastikas and SS bolts painted on the walls of the upper floor. So you indicate that this wasn't just put on there after Ukrainian forces left. For Kiev and
even
Lviv,
like these stickers have been faded with time. They were quite old. You could see the swastikas, the tiles had chipped off in places. Like, it's not like someone showed up and did all that. So Which is a frequent accusation.
Right. For Kiev and Lviv, kill Russians, it says here, and Donbas will be ours, which means, I mean, endless warfare.
Mhm.
And here you see what's going on in this picture.
In the bottom you have the flag with the black stripe on top is the flag of the Donetsk People's Republic, and you have presumably soldiers having their head shot off, and then you have a Russian flag shoved in the mouth of a decapitated combatant.
Yeah, they're blowing the and you can see
these were next to like drawings that their children had sent them too, that they hung up on the wall, which I didn't include in the report, but it was pretty disturbing to see that, like, sort of nice kids drawings of a garden in the sun next to pictures like this. And that guy, Ivan Maslov, I think his last name was, we spent the day together. Actually, he was the one who had been held there for a month. And, you know, he said he was beaten every day, and sort of psychologically tortured. And eventually, that, you know, they stopped beating him when there was nothing left to beat. And eventually he was swapped out in a prisoner exchange. But, you know, interestingly, it wasn't just, I mean, this is what they did with enemy combatants that they found, you know, with who they call separatists. But there were also regular civilians that were being kept in there who either committed sort of petty offenses, traffic offenses, or somebody who got on somebody's bad side. And the description they gave was that it was basically a racket. You know, if you could pony up $1,000 or a car, then you could buy your way out, or your family could buy your way out. And
right.
there was a system of sort of forging paperwork, new paperwork, to send a lot. I guess a lot of cars were being used to get people out, and so they were forging paperwork to go back to Kiev. And, you know, I'm not going to say that. I guess that either Poroshenko, Zelensky's precursor, or Zelensky personally knew about this. I don't know, but certainly officials in Kiev knew about this. And the people who were staffing these prisons, and really most of the authorities around the Eastern Front there, were coming from the West. They weren't. It wasn't so much local Ukrainians that took up positions in the post-Maidan government and the SBU,
Right.
which is the Secret Service. It was almost always people coming from the West to occupy these positions.
Right. People coming from the West, from where in the West?
Well, from Kiev, from Lvov.
Right. You mean Western
I
Ukraine?
mean the west of Ukraine, which, you know, if you kind of understand the history of Ukraine, especially the nationalist movement, which of course was at its previous peak during the period of Stepan Bandera's collaboration with the Nazis. It was Western Ukraine where nationalism was always alive and well, and you know, the Soviets had to fight back against that very hard. And in the East, people consider themselves part of this larger Russian world.
Right.
um,
Right.
and sort of a Slavic brotherhood. There's this notion that kind of Russia and Belarus and Ukraine are all just kind of different brothers or cousins on a tree, different limbs on a tree. And then this notion that in Western Ukraine, among the nationalists, which again, that's a relatively new movement. I mean, it really came into being strongly during the Second World War with Bandera, who is honored with a national holiday in Ukraine now, and has many streets named after him. And you know, there's a claim that this is all about national identity. An interesting thing that I'll probably include in an article at some point. I interviewed a guy who was the head of the Ukrainian Association of Moldova. So he was Ukrainian by heritage, but lived in Moldova. And my American passport sort of disarmed him a little bit. And he was speaking fairly freely to me. And he said, you know, we're not Nazis. We want independence for our nation. We want sovereignty. We want our national identity. And the next sentence he said to me, literally the next thing he said was, By the way, did you know that in 2016 they did blood tests and it proved that Russians have Mongol blood and we have European blood? Right after saying we're not Nazis. um,
Right,
so
right.
this is the mindset out there.
And I mean, we've covered this extensively at the Grayzone. We've talked about it with a number of guests, but I guess I haven't had a chance to interview a significant number of people on the ground who were on, I would call it, on both sides of the ideological divide between West and Eastern Ukraine. You know, how else did you encounter this ideology? Which when you say that it kind of shocked you how omnipresent it was, this neo-Nazi ideology.
Well, look, I mean, of course, this prison we went to was the extent of the horror of that place was not something I anticipated. Um, but
Yeah.
also, we went to a town called Rubizhne, which was one of the places where I got closer to really live shelling, all the time. It was a town that had been liberated by the Russian army and the DNR forces just a few days before. And we went into an apartment that had been housing Ukrainian soldiers, and apparently a nationalist leader. He was the owner of the apartment before. Um, and we went inside, and I mean, it was just everywhere were the banners. They were part of the Chernigiv group, which is just another one of these right wing groups. um they had a big banner with the Russian warship "Go F yourself," with swastikas on it, and like the extent of the imagery we saw was something. But of course, people love to say, well, this must have all been staged. There was, the Russian press did it, or the government officials did it.
Right,
Okay,
right.
fine, you can say that. So, but when we were in there, I was with, I guess, maybe six other journalists that had been touring that day. I started to sniff around the apartment myself, and I went into a bedroom in the far end. I mean, the place was trashed, right? Because there'd been like live fighting in this apartment complex. Um, and I went into this bedroom by my, no one was in there, no Russian soldiers, no other press. And I started just kind of going through the bookshelf. I noticed a biography of Otto von Bismarck. And then I opened up a closed bookshelf, and I found a copy of Mein Kampf just sitting in there, with Mein Kampf in German on the front, and then it was written in Russian inside. So I mean, that struck me just because this was not staged. The Russian officials didn't even know it was there. They were sort of pleased to see me find it, or interested in the fact that I had found it. So that just stuck out to me because it was very much not something that could have been set up, because it was sort of hidden in a corner. But then when I started talking to, uh, for instance, in Melitopol, which there's sort of a tale of two cities between Mariupol and Melitopol. Both of them are quite near the Sea of Azov, just sort of outlet of the Black Sea, kind of east of Odessa, but west of Russia and above Crimea. Mariupol, of course, is where Azov dug in, and there was probably the most horrific fighting that we've seen in the entire conflict. Melitopol, the Ukrainian army completely abandoned as soon as the special operations began.
Right.
So nothing was shelled, nothing was destroyed, and going there was just a totally different situation. Uh, but I was there on Victory Day on May 9th, which of course is the celebration of the defeat of Nazi Germany, and probably the most important holiday to Russian people. That and New Year's. And this was the first time they were allowed to publicly celebrate that holiday since 2015. I think the first year after Maidan, they still had a Victory Day parade, and then there had been none. Uh, I thought, because the city was still under curfew, it's quite near the front, so there's a lot of, like I said, tentativeness. I mean, I think some of the residents are even scared that, what if the Ukrainians come back? So we thought, that there'll be a nice little show and some people will come out and we'll hear some interesting statements. Well, instead, look, I saw at least like 10,000 people come out on the street, and there were, old men and women as old as in their 80s that were sobbing tears of joy, and teenagers and 20-year-olds doing the same thing. And everybody kept repeating, we were not allowed to do this. at all for 8 years. We went to a ceremonial burial for 42 Red Army soldiers, the bodies of whom had been found all in the previous 8 years, and the Ukrainian authorities would not allow them a burial and would not allow an acknowledgement of them. And they had Red Army veterans coming out to be a part of that. But every single person who took at the end of this parade, there was sort of a series of mics set up, and a couple of the city officials, now under Russian control, came up and spoke, but they opened it up for other speakers to come up and kind of share, mostly veterans, but also kind of members of like civil organizations and whatnot. And every single one of them, they were talking about Victory Day and the triumph over Nazi Germany, but every single one of them talked about the defeat of Ukrainian fascism, uh, and how Nazis, they used the word Nazis, how Nazis had come in and taken their city over, and shut things down, and also really crippled the economy. That was one of the points that people would bring up a lot, was that this is very indicative of a fascist state. That working people really, their quality of life was eviscerated, especially like the communal funds, where people are paying for utilities in their apartments and whatnot. The prices for that went way, 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 way up. The industry was really sucked out of the region. The port industry slowed down. Public universities and hospitals were shut down all over the place. A lot of that had to do with the EU association agreement,
Right.
that Ukraine entered.
Which was austerity.
Yeah, yeah. Widespread. I think it was something like 60% of public universities were shut down. And everyone talked about this. We went and spoke to, I think he was 98 years old. This guy right next to Melitopol, who was a Red Army vet. He stormed Berlin. He said he signed his name on the Reichstag. Really like heroic dude, and way more with it cognitively than the current U.S. president. He reflected and waxed about his experience in the war, but really went on about how Ukraine had been a place where everyone considered themselves brothers, where Russians and Ukrainians considered themselves brothers, where Tajiks and Uzbeks and Tatars and Cossacks could sort of mix freely and work together. He talked about friendship and internationalism a lot, and he was really speaking communist language. And he said that these people came in as fascists and they separated everybody, and they ruined our society, and now we've been liberated. And look, this is just a refrain I heard everywhere. And then, of course, there were a number of people. The first was a young man who I met in Romania, who would not go on the record because he has family in Ukraine, and he was a socialist sort of organizer in Kiev. And look, a number of his friends had disappeared. A number of them had gone into hiding. A number of them had been sort of beaten up publicly by sort of roving Nazi gangs. And this was before I got there. Then, of course, I got there and I met Alexei Albu, who was a member of the trade unions in Odessa. And he was a survivor of the May 2nd, 2014 Odessa massacre, where the basically a trade union building in Odessa was stormed and set fire to, and people were just sort of killed left and right. He was given word from some comrades that he was about to be blamed for inciting it, and he fled, I think, first to Kharkiv, and then from there into Lugansk. And then Aurora, which I think you retweeted the interviews I had put up with them. This was a really impressive feminist Marxist collective in Donetsk. And one of their founding members had been living in Kiev because her husband, who's now serving on the front for the Donetsk People's Republic, he was originally from Kiev, and they were union organizers there, and they were also part of Borotba, which is a communist group in Ukraine that's of course illegal, like all of them, like all left-wing and opposition parties in Ukraine that have been outlawed. And they were originally threatened a lot because they opposed Maidan, and their trade union at large did not. This is Svetlana, who's on the left in this photo, and her husband. And then they fled to Kharkiv, and again they had some comrades who were disappeared and beaten. And I think they were at some kind of an event in a park in Kharkiv, and basically the same group of I think it was Pravi Sector, I'm not sure, just another one of these right-wing groups. There's sort of a who's who list of all of them who have kind of infiltrated civil society in Ukraine with a lot of Western American and European funding.
Pravi sector being right sector.
Yeah, as
one
in right wing.
Yeah.
And they were like physically trying to apprehend her husband. And they basically got the hell out of there, hid out in the woods with some friends, and then made their way briefly to Crimea and then back up to Donetsk, where she was from. But I mean, this was just happening all over the place. And they're sharing with me every day. There's actually a Telegram feed about political prisoners and those being persecuted in Ukraine that I've been trying to amplify a little bit. But I mean, there are stories every day of people being detained and apprehended. And most of them at this point, especially the people who have been apprehended since February, since the special operation began, nobody knows where the hell most of them are. And it's getting more widespread. I mean, of course, we saw there was a Ukrainian journalist who had fled to Spain who was going to be extradited back to Ukraine. There are calls coming from Ukrainian officials for Western journalists who are doing Russian propaganda to be included in war crimes tribunals. Like, I mean, the extent of the sort of attacks on anyone that goes that's pro-Russian is what they say in Ukraine, but really goes against the narrative of the Maidan regime. It's pretty fierce. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah, just to provide people with some context here, I think this is one of the most important points that needs to be addressed, which is that this is all occurring not just under the watch of Zelensky, who was at the Cannes Film Festival yesterday, before his actual constituency, which is basically Western elites who fancy him to be some hero of democracy. This is not just happening under his watch, it's happening under his orders. I mean, he has called for everyone perceived as a collaborator to be destroyed, and members of his regime, like the sort of advisor to the Interior Ministry, Anton Gerashenko, are openly supporting the assassination of local officials in Ukraine who negotiate with Russia, for example, to organize civilian corridors. I want to play a video of one mayor's appeal that we embedded, and Esha Krishnaswamy translated this and subtitled it. It's from our piece about Zelensky overseeing a campaign of assassination, disappearances, and torture of all political opposition after banning 13 parties, all the leftist parties, all the Eurosceptic parties, the anti-NATO parties, even a libertarian party, basically then arresting his leading opponent, Viktor Medvedchuk, apparently who was tortured by Ukrainian SBU. But here is... This is Gennady Matsegora. He's the mayor of Kupiansk in northeastern Ukraine, which I guess would be near the Russian border, and someone who would be inclined to negotiate with Russia, who has a large population of ethnic Russians living under his watch, whose daughter was being held hostage by the agents of the Ukrainian SBU as collateral against him because he negotiated.
Уважаемые жители Украины, хочу, чтобы вы услышали мое обращение президенту Украины Зеленскому Владимиру Александровичу, главе СБУ, министру обороны, уполномоченной по правам человека Верховной Рады Украины. Я мэр города Купянска Мацедора Геннадий Николаевич. Обращаюсь к вам, Владимир Александрович. В нашей семье горе. Пропала моя дочь, Мацедора Дарья Геннадьевна, 2002 года рождения. Последние 20 дней она находилась у своих друзей в Ивано-Франковской области. 3 дня назад ее задержали работники областного управления Ивано-Франковской области СБУ. И теперь семья, в которой она жила, 3 дня ее не видит. Они обратились с заявлением в полицию, прокуратуру. Я, в свою очередь, несколько дней назад обращался к представителю уполномоченного по правам человека Верховной Рады Украины. И нас убедили о том, что дальше документы уже переходят в Верховную Раду. Представитель СБУ вчера нас убедил, что к концу дня ее отпустят домой. Сейчас нам поступают угрозы о расправе над моей дочерью. Владимир Александрович, если вы считаете,
He's addressing Zelensky.
что я, как мэр города, совершил должностное преступление и один, без оружия, не противостоял, не противостоял вооруженной армии, судите меня. Если вам нужна моя жизнь, возьмите ее. Но помогите спасти дочь. Если с ней что-нибудь случится, я в этом буду видеть вас.
I don't know what's happened to his daughter. I don't know any follow up there, but you know, we have Vladimir Strok, who was the mayor of Kreminna, I believe, who was shot in the heart by Ukrainian SBU agents using neo-Nazis. And, you know, the government of Zelensky openly endorsed that murder. Other local officials 11 mayors are currently missing across Ukraine. This is a story that's been completely swept under the rug in US media, along with the torture of common people who are basically being saran wrapped. I mean, they're being wrapped to poles with packing tape, and now we've seen video of children beating them. We can throw up some of that video in a second. I don't know if YouTube will then put.
And Zelensky today has actually extended martial law in Ukraine for an additional 3 months. So I think originally it was instituted for 30 days twice. And this martial law has made this kind of stuff much easier, because pieces of it include the curfew that's been introduced, labor service, and a draft into the army, but also the suspension and the prohibition of any elections, the prohibition of any demonstrations and rallies, and basically the suspension of anything that resembles due process, what little there was that existed, which wasn't much in Ukraine before this. But now this has been extended for another 90 days, and it seems like it's just kind of indefinite.
Yeah, it's sort of like a Pinochet style situation where we have an interview with the Grayzone with a Ukrainian academic who's studied Zelensky's rise, researched it, wrote about it in a book, Olga Baisha, and she described him sort of as a Pinochet style figure in that he's implementing neoliberal austerity policies that are sapping Ukraine of its public assets and its public wealth, basically putting it all in the hands of his donors in the private sector, and at the same time repressing all of his opponents brutally while being celebrated in Western media. I mean, did Ukrainians describe that kind of scenario to you? I mean, this obviously affected people in the East too.
No, I mean, it absolutely did. And people in the West. I mean, again, when I got to Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, which actually per capita saw more refugees come in than anyone else, the numbers were bigger in Poland. But one of the reasons I went to Moldova is because there's a considerable presence of sort of Russian people there too. And I spoke to a lot of Ukrainians that were coming through the refugee centers there that did not have nice things to say about Zelensky. This is definitely a part of the narrative. But I think the biggest parts of the narrative that I hear from Ukrainians, especially in the East, about Zelensky, is that this is somebody who's not motivated by any of his own principles.
Right.
Is that this is somebody who's completely directed by Washington, and to some extent the UK. Actually, people in Ukraine really play up the role that the UK has in this, also more than I expected. And the MI6 as almost equivalent to the CIA in terms of their involvement.
Well, it's certainly more
But
aggressive, at least overtly. I mean, the statements
yeah,
from British officials have been more aggressive than those of Americans.
yeah, yeah.
I,
Which may have to do with kind of the relations between Germany and Russia that had gotten much better. Um, but that this was a guy who, when he was elected, a lot was talking about uh, before the before he was elected, was talking about getting rid of some of the bans on Russian language. 'Cause the backdrop to that is that one of the main issues that caused a lot of this, what's really a civil war. I mean, it's a civil war. It's not an invasion from one side or the other. It's not separatists. It's not a Russian intervention. It's a civil war. Um, so this issue that the Russian language had been officially banned in a nation where more than half the people speak Russian as their first language. He was talking about eliminating those laws. He was talking about peace in Donbas. Um, and I think people really thought that it might get a little better than it was under Poroshenko before him, and immediately the opposite happened. And so there's this weird balance of power in Ukraine. There's sort of Zelensky's contingency in Kiev. There's still the Poroshenko contingency that preceded him, that especially kind of has some influence amongst law enforcement. Then there's civil society, sort of the NGO world, which is like half Western outfits and half Nazis in suits. And then you have the military and the actual battalions and the overt white nationalists. And all of them have kind of strange conflicting relationships with one another,
right.
but at the end they have the same daddy,
Right.
and that's back in DC. I mean, even Ukrainian nationalists say this. Even people who are waving the flag Slava Geroyam, they'll say this too. They'll say, yeah, the Americans came in and helped us retake our country. So
Right.
no one's denying the role that the U.S. is playing in all of this. And most people in Donbas and in Russia, especially older people who have a very internationalist and sort of leftover Soviet anti-imperialist mindset, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They're fighting against the Americans. They understand that this is, a war against the representatives of DC, and I heard the word vassal state used very often there
Right.
in reference to the government in Kiev. So it's not Ukraine versus Russia so much as I said, as it is a civil war that's broken out within Ukraine between a Western-funded puppet government and people who identify in some capacity as Russian in Ukraine, which is millions of people.
We're getting a lag on your Wi-Fi, so I'm going to remove you from the studio for a second and see if that helps at all. Yeah, the lag is still there. And for those of you who are just joining, I mean, our numbers are increasing, and hopefully it'll improve the quality of the chat, which isn't our best today. But Russell, Texas Bentley's Wi-Fi has been severely complicated, possibly by sanctions. As I said before, Zoom will not operate in the newly independent Donetsk People's Republic. And we may have a similar situation with StreamYard. I'm going to try to get Fergie back in the chat, but we've lost your video. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. I didn't know we were having issues.
Yeah, is everyone else seeing an issue there?
Of course, I've been operating mostly with a VPN here.
Okay, well, that's what you got to do. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to play a clip of because you were accompanying Texas on some of your journalistic voyages out into the field in the past few days. I want to play a clip of that he sent me earlier today of him actually visiting an abandoned, or you could call it liberated, prison that was being used by the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion. And it's classic Tejas.
Oh, this was the SBU office in Mariupol.
Ah, sorry.
This is the old SBU building in Mariupol. Secret police, Nazis. We went through, looked around, found the Azov calendar from 2021. There might be some Azov calendars from 2022. But I'll tell you something. There's not going to be one from 2023.
So yeah, the Azov Battalion has been defeated, or we could put it in the framing of the Associated Press and the US media, which says that Azov has wrapped up its combat operations in Mariupol because the Azovstal steel plant has been evacuated. In fact, they surrendered. They were defeated. They decided not to die and make this final fatal stand, which, was the fear. And, there's video and photos of them actually being treated in hospital beds by the people that they had been tormenting for years in Lugansk and Donetsk. And some of the soldiers from the people's militias are sleeping on the floor. So this is a remarkable scene. And I guess you were in Mariupol. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we're with Fergie Chambers audio only right now. What did you see in Mariupol? And after we get your account, I'm going to try to get Texas on the line. I'm just going to call him and see what happens. But go ahead.
So actually, when I was in Mariupol, was just about 3 days ago now. Texas and I were there together, and we didn't go to Azovstal this time because at that point it was, I guess, a day before this surrender started to happen, and there was there's nothing to see there except for it being shelled. But we definitely saw a city that had been totally cleared of any Ukrainian combatants other than Azovstal. And I spoke to a number of civilians myself, especially people who lived around the theater where there was this kind of now notorious explosion that occurred, which I guess no one is really sure. Yeah, there it is. How it happened. Although, look, this was an interesting thing that I'm going to follow up on more because I want to speak to the forensics expert that the DNR sent there, because we went inside. And above all else, what you notice is that the damage is more extensive, especially to the ceilings on the bottom floors of the building. And
Right.
The walls seem to have expanded everywhere, which lines up with a story a theory that we're hearing from a lot of people, especially a lot of the locals, that there may have been a charge placed inside of the building as opposed to it having been hit with a rocket. Everyone in the neighborhood said that the Ukrainians were almost corralling people into this theater in the days before this explosion happened. They were, moving sort of food supplies there, telling people to come and take shelter, and this is where you'll find it. And the other thing that a lot of the residents said is that when the Russian army and the DNR forces were still at least 100 kilometers away from the actual city center and the fighting was going on the outskirts, that Ukrainian soldiers started basically blowing everything in sight up. At least a half dozen personal narratives of people saying, yeah, a Ukrainian tank rolled up to our building and blasted a shell at it. And then everywhere, not just Mariupol, whether it was in Kirovsk, if you're in Gorlovka, if you're in Rubish, anywhere up and down the Donbas front, the story is exactly the same. And it's a lot about what we heard in Syria too, which is that these, especially these Azov fighters, but Ukrainian soldiers, embed themselves in residential buildings on different floors of the building, have snipers up on the roof, and they do not let the residents of the buildings leave, and they keep them on other floors,
Right.
so as to build a human shield. This every single city I went to that had been occupied by Ukrainian forces, independent civilians told me this, whether I was on a tour where there was an official press center involved, or whether I was just there completely on my own, walking around and talking to people. No one gave a different account of how the Ukrainians were fighting, and no one described the Russian army as having done anything like that.
Right.
Which is an interesting point too, because I think, there's a lot of back and forth about who's winning the war, and of course, whoever's propaganda you're listening to, you're going to get a different story about this. But the pace of the Russian progress on the front, and it is progress. I mean, they're gaining territory slowly and steadily. To me, it seems very clear that it's happening at a very slow pace, because they're actually, contrary to the Western narrative, being painstakingly careful about not creating unnecessary damage and not unnecessarily killing civilians. And this is what we heard from the people we spoke to in Mariupol as well. And it's what I heard from two families that I spoke to in Romania, who also had left Mariupol right after the beginning of the fighting. Was the same thing, that they were being used as human shields, that they were locked in a basement and not allowed to leave, and they had a window of opportunity and got the hell out, and they were way too scared to go on record about it.
Right.
But this is what I've heard everywhere about how they're fighting.
Well, I've just I don't know if you read my piece at the Grayzone on the Mariupol theater, first of all, but it was pretty obvious to me, or it appeared to me from the beginning, that the official story of 300 killed in a Russian airstrike was just fishy, because there were no bodies. There were no photos of any bodies. There were no names of any dead. There was an obvious evacuation the day before the explosion took place. The Azov Battalion controlled the entire area around the theater. Fighting was taking place nearby. Everybody has, smartphones, but there was no image or footage of the airstrike, let alone the aftermath of the airstrike. There was said to be a rescue, but there was no white helmet style footage of the rescue. And, then I was able to look at Maxar satellite images of the theater before and after. And the day before, cars had been removed from the perimeter of the theater. No vehicles were around it. They were all taken away. No, sorry. There were vehicles the day before the explosion all around the theater. The day after, no vehicles. So if there had been an unexpected Russian airstrike, those vehicles would have still been there, destroyed. I also had found images, ironically enough, on the Human Rights Watch report on the Russian attack, and it showed men placing objects, including large barrels, against the theater. And it was said, and they were all military age men. There were no women or children anywhere in sight, and they were cutting down trees nearby. And they were said to be making a field kitchen. So there were all these suspicious clues. And now I've interviewed Alejandro Kirk. I don't know if you know him. He's reporting from Telesur. He visited the theater, told me it appeared.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, he said it appeared to, but he couldn't be sure, to be an explosion from the inside. And you're telling me something similar.
Yeah, I mean, I walked through the whole theater, and through the middle of it, and again, the thing that was most compelling, like I said, because you look up at the ceiling, and if you're on the basement level or the ground level, the ceiling is completely destroyed in the area outside where the main stage would have been. But when you get to the second and third stories above that, there's much less damage up on the top, where theoretically a rocket would have hit the roof.
Right. Right.
And then also in sort of the fire hatches, I sometimes I'm forgetting how to say things in English now. The damage is much more extensive on the lower levels too, and you see this, like, these expanded walls, as if some kind of charge occurred inside that caused that pressurized the building. So there's apparently a pretty extensive forensic report on this, And I reached out to the ombudsman in Donetsk, and they sent me a bunch of stuff, and then I've been on trains for a couple days. So I'm going to look through all that too, and sort of couple this with some of the accounts and the eyewitness testimonies that I got when I was in Mariupol. But I mean, it's definitely a supremely fishy story. I should also say that while Mariupol looks, I mean, it's startling how it looks right now, and the damage that's occurred there. But if you compare that to a month ago, the amount of cleanup that's already happened in the streets is pretty impressive. They had reestablished electricity to a number of neighborhoods in the city. There's some running water back in the city. Cell phone service has come back with the Phoenix, which is like the sort of Donbas network. And people seem very confident that the city's going to be rebuilt very quickly. And I guess there's a lot of money coming in from Moscow, and they're trying to clear the port out right now so that basically they can start bringing rebuilding supplies in. They're also bringing about 100 tons of food in per day. It's all coming from the Russian Federation. I think there were 450 local volunteers from Mariupol that are working in these centers. And we toured the biggest one. Texas and I were there. And I think there are now 2 others. So, you know, again, this narrative about like who's committing war crimes and who's supplying humanitarian aid, as far as I can tell, everything we heard about Ukrainian occupation was people being detained, put into torture cells, and having buildings blown up by their own occupying army. And as soon as the Russians come nearby, there are humanitarian corridors. There's an incredible amount of humanitarian aid. There are pretty extensive efforts to rebuild and to reestablish infrastructure as quickly as possible. And I know that this, sounds like cheerleading, but it's what I've seen. And you can't, I can't debate with what I've seen.
Yeah.
And look, some of this is not just because of the goodness of the Russian heart. Some of it is just simply pragmatic, that a lot of this territory will presumably now become part of the Russian Federation. And it's not in the interest of Russia to go in there and destroy everything and piss everyone off. Which is why some of what appear to be kind of false flags, things like Bucha or all this stuff we're hearing about Russian war crimes. Like, again, even if the Russians were as evil as they like to portray them in the West for the last 100 years or so, it just wouldn't make sense from a utilitarian perspective, to come in and wreak havoc like that in territories that you're trying to establish sovereignty in.
Right. I mean, Mariupol's highly strategic. It's on the Sea of Azov. So for Russia to take it, incorporate it, at least into the independent republics, that would leave Odessa on the Black Sea. And I don't know if there's going to be an operation there, but if you close off the Sea of Azov and Black Sea to Ukrainian rump state, you've pretty much neutralized NATO's entire agenda there. And so it would be in your interest to revitalize those cities. And we saw what Russia did in, for example, East Aleppo, after East Aleppo was liberated from Al-Qaeda aligned forces. There is a, there's a pattern here. And so I agree, whether it's out of their own, the goodness of their own hearts or not, there's a clear geostrategic interest in restoring services and the population to Mariupol.
And I think another point that's important about the Russian involvement in all this too, I don't know if it's a little off topic, but it's a very strong position of almost everyone in Donbas. If you're in the Donetsk People's Republic or the Lugansk People's Republic, and I went pretty extensively through both, if they're upset with Putin, they're upset with Putin for coming too late. Not for not exhausting diplomatic options and being warlike and invading when he shouldn't have. They're upset because they have been subjected to constant shelling for 8 years. And look, I equate this with some of the conflicts that these so-called Western leftists are really ready to get behind. I mean, look, most people who call themselves leftists that aren't delusional Democrats in the West don't have that much of a hard time now getting behind the Palestinian resistance.
Right.
Syria, of course, is more complicated, but look, what I mean, I haven't been to Gaza. A lot of my very good friends have, but what people have faced in occupied Palestine, and what a lot of Western leftists are so ready to get behind, is not very different from what people, especially along the western boundaries of Donbas, have been facing for 8 years. And you know, I was with Russell the last day I was there at his wife's father's house, you know, and we were just hearing shells go off everywhere around us.
Yeah.
And he texted me the next day when I was on the train heading back to Russia and said, by the way, the school next to Ludmila's dad's got hit this morning.
Right. Right.
You know, and again, without any Ministry of Defense or any press center representatives or soldiers, anywhere you go, especially in the western edge of the city of Donetsk, which has probably been hit more consistently and more regularly than anywhere else in Donbas, the first thing anyone says is, yep, every day for 8 years, every day for 8 years. And nobody has any idea about this in the West, and they try to tell you it's propaganda, and then you sit there and listen to the fireworks 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah, I mean, we've been addressing it at the Grayzone for as long as we've been around. I've had Russell, Texas, Bentley on before this escalation or operation or whatever you want to call it began, several times, and this is what he was constantly talking about, was the just constant shelling. He and his family were living under 5 kilometers from what was on February 24th the front line. I know it's now extended. Let's try to get Russell on by phone. I know he's recently been online. We can't get him on with Wi-Fi for whatever reason, and as you can see, our guest Fergie Chambers is having some Wi-Fi troubles, but at least we can hear him. So I'm going to try and do this. We've never done this live, but let's see what happens.
Hey, Max.
Hey, Russ, you're live with the Grayzone.
Hey, Jim.
Can everybody
buddy.
hear? I'm going to turn up the gain a little bit. So sorry we couldn't get you on by Wi-Fi, but tell us.
Hold on, I got a lag of about 2 or 3 seconds.
Okay, well, you know, why don't you just cut loose? Tell us, you know, what you've seen for the past few weeks and what the state of play is on the ground. Is anybody winning?
Okay, first I want to say thanks to both of you guys for supporting the truth. It was great to work with Jim here for the last couple of weeks, and of course, it's always good to see you, Max, and really appreciate your defense of the truth on this issue. What's happening right now is the opposite, as always, of what the Western media is saying. Russia is winning. We took 900, almost 1,000, 986 prisoners out of Azovstal, Nazi Azov Battalion Nazis that surrendered. The whole thing about them being evacuated, they were evacuated by their captors without their weapons. And here's a good picture I want to mention about this real quick too, Western propaganda. This is a picture of me standing on University Avenue in Donetsk City about a week after a Tochka-U bomb massacred 24 civilians driving down the street on a Monday afternoon. The day after that happened, on March 14th, La Stampa, Italian propaganda rag, written on the front page, they ran a photograph of the dead bodies in the same exact place where I'm standing And then the above the headlines, yeah. Okay, see this? This is exactly where I was standing. And they're saying, oh, the carnage. And this little red line across the top, it's saying, oh, Russia continues to attack, and Russia is Ukraine is preparing for the Russian onslaught. This is a picture of dead people that were killed by a Ukrainian bomb attacking Donetsk. And this Italian rag is implying that it's a Ukrainian city with Ukrainian civilians murdered by Russian bombs. It is the exact opposite of the truth. And it's not exactly only in the EU too. Max, if you can throw up that other one of the New York Post.
Yeah, I don't have it. I don't have it right now, but
Okay.
I'll get it up there in a second.
Okay. Well, what happened was about 2 weeks after this massacre on University Avenue in Donetsk, then the Ukrainians bombed an apartment building in Petrovsky. Jim went there with me. He's seen it too. It blew like the top three stories off of this apartment building. And the next day, the New York Post, one of the oldest newspapers in the USA and also another complete propaganda rag, they show the photograph of the apartment building in Donetsk bombed by U-Crops, and it says, the headline says, Russians continue to bomb Ukrainian cities. So, and you know what? I mean, Russia is bombing military objects in Ukrainian cities. That's true. But they put a photograph again of a civilian target that was hit by Ukrainian bombing, and then they say that it's Russians bombing Ukraine. I mean, this is the opposite of the truth. It's really despicable, and it's a real hard thing for me to try and put up with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we're hearing right now, Russell, is that, and we hear this constantly, Russian forces are being pushed back. The Zelensky has said that the battle in the Donbas region has stalled. We were told that, well, the framing around the surrender of the Azov Battalion in Mariupol is that combat operations have been completed, as though they achieved some sort of objective instead of actually surrendered. But what is really happening on the ground? I mean, you've been embedded with Donetsk People's Militia Forces. What are you actually seeing there? Have these forces been actually making progress, or is it as the Western media and Ukrainian government says?
No, bro. The combat operations of Azov Nazis and Ukrainian army have been completed in Mariupol because there aren't any more there. They're either dead or they ran away, or now they're prisoners in Donetsk. We got like 1,000 of them in prisoner here in Donetsk now. The sick ones, the wounded ones are getting treated. You know, these guys from Azov got a lot to answer for. And the ones that are war criminals, the ones that have committed war crimes, are going to pay for them. DPR does have the death penalty. And that's why they're going to be tried here instead of in Russia, which doesn't. And you know what? It only makes sense. These are mad dogs. These are genuine Nazis. They have, you know, the taste of human blood. They have grown fond of murdering civilians. I saw a guy today that was saying, you know, for the last 8 years, they've done anything they want. This is a literal quote. He said, they fire a machine gun into a crowd like you or me look at each other. You know, they rob, they rape whoever they want. And so, you know, they get, you know, that bloodthirstiness. It can't be cured, man. The only way to cure it is with a nice strong rope or 10 grams of lead. And we're going to cure them. We're going to put them out of their misery. You know, I'm a religious guy. I believe in God. I believe in judgment. And, you know, putting these guys down just saves them from committing more sins that they're going to have to pay for when they stand before God someday. So really, I don't feel, I mean, the first time I saw a couple of Azov and Pravi sector prisoners in Volnovakha in the first few days of the liberation of the Operation Z, I kind of felt sorry for them because I knew their life had changed and it was going to be different for a long time. But then when it came out, we started seeing these videos that the Nazis, the Ukrainian Nazis, were publishing themselves, of them cutting throats of Russian prisoners of war, of them shooting, kneecapping, or shooting in the knees, shooting in the genitals, Russian POWs, and then letting them bleed out and die. You know, once you see that, it's like your feeling of sympathy for them is pretty much done. You know.
Yeah, we're looking at
We are
footage of them
winning. We
being.
are absolutely advancing. I mean, the main thing that you need to do is look at the level of death and destruction of the military power of both countries. Russia is using less than 15% of its military power at this point in Ukraine. And Ukraine, basically, more than 80% of its military power has either been destroyed or at least neutralized, immobilized. There's about 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers on the Donbas front, you know, including a bunch of them just a couple of miles from where I'm sitting right now in Donetsk. It looks like the next battle will be to surround and either capture or destroy, you know, a major percentage of the Ukrainian military power that's on the Donbas front. That would be the next logical and expected move. Of course, Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War that you should always do what's unexpected. So somebody should tell Zelensky that while he's looking at all these people getting ready to get surrounded down here in Donetsk, I mean, Ukrainian army on the Donbas front, don't be surprised if he gets about 500,000 Russian and Belarusian soldiers knocking on his front door in downtown Kiev one morning in the near future too. You know, there's no way to tell what exactly the next move is going to be by Russia. That's perfect military strategy. But if it is going to be on the Donbas front, then, you know, and there's enough power here now, especially all the troops that have been released from Mariupol, they're coming straight up here, man. And the Donbas front line on our side is going to be the anvil, and the Russian troops coming around from behind are going to be the hammer. And they either have the choice of, you know, the Ukrainian army has the choice of either raising its hands or, you know, grabbing its ankles.
Well, we've learned that Zelensky has fired his top territorial commander. Pretty significant news. The Ukrainian Telegram channels are lighting up with discussions about tension between Zelensky and his general military command, which is not getting the reinforcement it needs in the east and is seeking several withdrawals. And Zelensky is, you know, according to the chatter I'm seeing, demanding that they stay and fight. And when you talk about Zelensky, you would have to assume Zelensky is being kind of puppeteered by his Western patrons who are saying, you know, we're going to send in tons of heavy weapons and you just got to stay and fight. We know that Boris Johnson arrived in Kiev to prevent Zelensky from negotiating with Russia. What do you think of this chatter, Russell Bentley and Fergie Chambers? What do you all think of this chatter? Does it match up with the situation on the ground?
Well, I mean, first of all, Zelensky is a complete puppet. All his military guys are complete puppets. All they do is follow orders. Those orders come from D.C., London, and Brussels. mostly from DC. And you know, it's like laughable to see Zelensky yelling at his military underlings when they're only following the orders of their masters in DC.
Yeah.
You know, it is criminally insane and a genuine war crime for them to do anything except surrender. The outcome of this war was 100% absolutely inevitable before it started. And I mean, I'm talking about the Operation Z. The war's been going on for 8 years. And now comes the time when it's going to get, you know, the old saying that, you know, other people start wars, Russia ends them. And Russia's coming in to end this war. They're going to take as much of Ukraine as they want, and neither the Ukrainian army, with however many billions of dollars of weapons the West gives them, nor even NATO, if NATO comes in with their full power, they won't be able to stop Russia. Because, like I said, Russia's using 15% right now of its troops, armor, artillery, air power, rocket power, missile power. If it gets, you know, anywhere near serious, they can use 1/3 of their military power and absolutely overwhelm anybody in Ukraine. So, you know, it's the longer that this war goes on, and it is, of course, the strategy of the West to keep it going on as long as possible, to cause as much death and destruction as possible. The longer it goes on, the more people are going to have to be buried, and the more infrastructure that's going to have to be rebuilt. And Russia's going to do it. I mean, as Jim said, you know, Russia is bringing in just to Mariupol, just to the city of Mariupol, 100 tons of water and 100 tons of food every single day, day after day after day. And that's just in Mariupol. I mean, they're bringing in more everywhere else too, you know, and not a single cent, not a single penny is coming from the Ukrainian government, who still says that, you know, Mariupol is their citizens. You know, not a single penny of it is of human aid is coming from, you know, the West or the EU or all these human aid groups and stuff like that. It's, you know, it would be a starvation, humanitarian catastrophe if Russia wasn't helping these people, but they are, and they're saving them, and none of these other hypocrite Nazis are doing anything for them.
Yeah, you know, we spoke. Go ahead, Jim.
No, I was just going to say that the humanitarian side of this is very interesting. How much sort of the Western humanitarian approach has been politicized. Like, I was very surprised when we were in Rubizhne. Russell was not there with me on that day. We spoke to one of the volunteers in a refugee center, and this is the town that, again, had been liberated by the DNR forces and some Chechens about 3 days before, and to a man, everyone there said that the destruction we saw in the city had all been caused by Ukrainians, both on their way out and after they left. But that the Red Cross, as soon as the special operation started, the Red Cross vacated their office in the region and stopped responding to any calls from local volunteers and humanitarian organizations. You know, we heard things like this a lot, that sort of Russian humanitarian or Western humanitarian aid was already sorely lacking and not paying much attention to people in Donbas. But then as soon as the popularity contest in the West turned against Russia, they just completely vanished.
Right. And thank you, Poco Loco, for the super chat. Thank you, Oscar Chavez, for the super sticker. Thanks to everyone for the super chats. Hit the like button and help us beat Nina Jankowicz's algorithm. By the way, she's out the door. And definitely subscribe to our channel. Our subscriptions have been suppressed over the ever since March 2020. I don't know what happened on that date. But thanks everybody for tuning in. We're here with Fergie Chambers, who is just crossed over into Russian Federation territory, and Russell Bentley. Russell, where are you right now?
I'm in the center of Donetsk City, my home for the last 8 years.
Okay, well, yeah, great. Well, let's talk about that. I mean, we spoke, I think, 48 hours before Russian forces entered Ukraine in force on February 24th, I believe it was. It was at 26th. What date was it? When did Putin end the pandemic?
The same day.
Yeah. Okay. So 48 hours before I spoke to you, and I'd been asking you, and we'd had a Russian diplomat on, and I'd asked, is Russia going to go in? Is it going to invade or launch a special military operation, as the Biden administration was saying, quote, citing U.S. intelligence reports and referring to all the training operations that were taking place, and a lot of people didn't believe Biden, because why would you? Why would you believe the U.S., which has lied so much? It was like they were saying, just 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and Russia will invade by Tuesday. But you said very clearly Russia is going to go in and wage a massive or major military operation, and you used the term denazification. So you were correct.
Yep.
Yeah, you were.
Vladimir Putin has used the term denazification too, and it's legit. It's not a exaggeration or rhetoric. It's really what we're doing there, and it's what needs to be done. And the most important thing that anybody that wants to try and talk reason to somebody that thinks that this is a Russian invasion, they have to understand that Russia knew, and some of my friends here in the military knew and told me that the Ukrainian army had 150,000 soldiers with all, fuel, food, ammo, and the plan. They were going to make a major assault in the first week of March into the main cities of the Donbas and of the Donbas republics, Lugansk and Donetsk, Makiivka, Gorlovka, and they were going to do to our cities here what they did in Mariupol, which was use human shields. But once Russia defeated and liberated Mariupol, once Russia took military control over Mariupol, the first thing they did was start bringing in human aid. These Ukrainian assault forces were going to come in, blend in with the civilians, which would have, protected them from Russia's main military advantages, which is their air force, their missiles, their artillery, and then just start slaughtering people. And they weren't going to bring in human aid to the Donbas cities. They were going to bring in the Einsatz Gruppen. They were going to be bringing in the Azov and the Pravi sector and the Idar and the Donbas, these, mass murdering, genuine Nazi psychopath killers. And they were going to commit genocide here. That was the plan. Their strategy was human shields of the civilians, and then they just start coming in and wiping them out. It was a plan of genocide and ethnic cleansing, and it was within a week of happening when Operation Z started. And you got to understand that the main cities in our republics are on the front line. I mean, my house in Petrovsky district is about 5 kilometers. Jim's been there. He's seen and heard from the very front line. And the center of the city is about 10 or 12. So if the Ukrops had attacked and made it in even 5 or 10 kilometers, which you can do in a day, and if it's a main task force, full on armored offensive, then it's like it's Mariupol in reverse. It's like Fallujah. It's like Stalingrad, and that was their plan. And You know, thank God and Vladimir Putin that Russia came in when they did before they started that plan, because it literally saved hundreds of thousands of human, innocent civilian lives.
Yeah, this is, you know, referred to as disinformation in the US, that there was a Ukrainian military escalation. It's just called Russian disinformation, Russian propaganda. And while I can't say for certain that the Russian Duma report was correct or not, which made this allegation, Russell, what you described to me 48 hours before this massive military escalation, which saw Russia at least momentarily driving towards Kiev, was escalation and attacks on your area immediately in Donetsk, including with Grad rockets. I mean, that is something that I think no one disputes, which was that there was an escalation from the Ukrainian side, which may have triggered the Kremlin to make this decision.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of this is that
escalating, you know,
we'll get you in there, Fergie.
Since the beginning of the year.
Okay.
And also the buildup of weapons and ammo and fuel and reinforcement soldiers. I mean, there's about 50,000 on the front line of Ukrainian troops on the front line, the Donbas front. Now there was 150 right before Operation Z kicked in, man. And that 150 was really, I mean, I can guarantee it, dude. I mean, from every way that you can measure it, dude, from the escalation of their attacks, their artillery attacks against the city, of the reinforcement, the buildup of forces, you know, from the plans that Russia discovered and publicized, they really were getting ready to come in.
Yeah. Yeah. And Fergie, you were going to say something to that point.
Well, yeah. So, you know, we had this first day in February, I think it was February 16th, when the U.S. guaranteed that the Russians were going to invade the next day. You know, sort of very broadly, you know, this is going to happen. They're on the border, and the invasion is a foregone conclusion, and it didn't happen. And this kind of like boy who cried wolf situation lingered throughout the beginning of February. And we see at the same time that there was an intense escalation in Ukrainian attacks on Donbas. And it's not just from people who lived there saying that it felt that way. It's not just Russell saying so. Even if you look at the OSCE, sort of the camera reports, that there are a number of cameras that were put on either side of the front line in Donbas by very much a Western-friendly organization called the OSCE. I hold them in very high regard. But the cameras didn't lie. You saw an escalation in shelling, and you see every day who shelled first. And it was Ukraine. And at the same time, you have Zelensky showing up in Munich saying, we are not going to honor the Minsk agreements whatsoever. We are not going to pursue neutrality. And even sort of dangling this idea that they weren't going to adhere to 30-year-old nuclear non-proliferation agreements. And all of this, you know, of course, the German Chancellor Scholz was supposedly, I think it was reported about a month ago, that he was urging Zelensky to go towards neutrality at that point. But he showed up in Munich and basically said "F you" to everybody.
Right.
And then these attacks increased, and then we see the special operation begin. Because look, to me and to a lot of people who were down there, it seemed like the fact that Putin didn't invade when the U.S. said he would sort of empowered, especially these Nazi battalions down there, and they thought, all right, well, you know, game on, we can do whatever we want.
Right.
So I think, again, I don't know if it was a foregone conclusion in the beginning of February that Russia was going to go in, but the way that the chips fell, egged on incredibly strongly by the U.S. and the U.K., made it inevitable.
I mean, there was a massive buildup of Russian forces on the borders around the frontiers of Ukraine. One thing I've heard, correct me if I'm wrong, is that those forces began to recede up until the Munich conference, where Zelensky and Schultz started puffing their chests out, and then it was on.
Well, I think that the Russian buildup along the Ukrainian border was an attempt to dissuade the Ukrainians and their U.S. masters from making the offensive into Donbas. Once they understood, because of their intelligence sources in the general staff and the high command of the Ukrainian military, that it was going to happen, then like Putin said when he grew up on the streets of Leningrad, he said, if the fight is inevitable, it's better to hit first. And they tried to dissuade it. They tried to prevent it. But once they knew that it was going to happen, then they had to come in. And really, believe me, it is one of the great humanitarian things that's happened in the 21st century is that they prevented the attack of the Ukrainian army into the cities of the Donbas republics.
Yeah. Putin was a student of judo, still practices judo. There are many stories of his, including by Western journalists who deeply despise him, winning street fights back in the day. I guess you learn in judo. Fergie, you do Muay Thai, right?
Yeah, and then box. Yeah.
And you box. So you learn, like, if a big group's coming up on you to attack you, you just hit the biggest guy first and try to take him down.
Or you run away. But
so to that point, there was a, New York Times had this on the front page of its online edition late last night. A guest on Russian Channel 1 state TV on the main discussion show. I forget his name. He's a popular pundit. He's
Solovyov?
No. That's the host who's, considered one of the main voices of the sort of united Russian front, pro-Putin, etc., pro-Kremlin. But this is a guest who is deeply critical of the Russian military operation, and he savaged a lot of the tactical mistakes. I mean, do either of you think Russia committed, tactical or strategic errors going in? Have those mistakes, if made, been corrected?
Well, I can tell you that they did make some pretty serious mistakes going in there. In every war, both sides make huge mistakes, man. That's inevitable because the other side is trying to make you to make mistakes. Every time you walk into an ambush, that's a huge mistake, and if anybody lives to learn from that mistake, then you may not do it the next time, but yes, Russia made one of the main mistakes, one of the most terrible mistakes that you can make by underestimating their enemy when they first came in. And that cost them a lot of guys. It cost them a lot of blood, a lot of equipment. They understand now what it is they're facing, and they're starting to handle it. Yes, both sides have made mistakes. And, I had a good friend of mine died on the 9th of May. He was killed in action because of a stupid mistake, because his commander was taking a column of vehicles. They didn't send recon out ahead. They got in an ambush, and the commander, who is already known for some years as being a bad commander tactically and otherwise, he froze up, and he didn't say either let's go forward or let's go back. The vehicle my friend was in got hit. He was mortally wounded, and he died on the way to the hospital. He saved a younger soldier. He was 46 years old, one of my best friends here, and his body took the shot that shielded a 20-year-old soldier who lived. And That guy's name was Sergei Lysenko, and he was an example to the world. He was a poet, a musician, a badass soldier. He was a sculptor. He was a gardener. He was a deeply religious man and one of the nicest guys that ever lived. And, you know, that's the tragedy. A stupid mistake costs good men lives. But the thing that, again, I say, all you have to do is look at the losses on the Ukrainian side versus the losses on the Russian side. And of course, you can take them both with a grain of salt. But, you know, the realistic story is that, and first of all, Russia is coming in with less soldiers than there are Ukrainian soldiers defending. And usually, I mean, and basically always, it is a basic military tactic, or should I say principle, that if the attacking force needs to have a 3-to-1 numerical advantage in order to expect victory against the defending force. And Russia is coming in with less than 1-to-1 numerical parity. And, you know, they haven't taken all of Ukraine yet, but they've taken a nice big chunk of it. And they're, you know, they're not retreating anywhere. The attacks up around Kiev were feints. They were distractions. They were diversions. And what's happening now is the Russia is going to seal up and completely neutralize one way or the other the Donbas front, and then probably some of them will go to handle Odessa, and then the rest of them are just going to start heading west as far as they want to go.
Yeah.
And the Ukrainian army can't stop them, and if NATO comes in, they're going to wish they didn't, and they won't stop them either.
Well, first of all, you believe there will be an attack on Odessa, an attempt to take Odessa, and how far west would they go? I mean, would they go across the Dnipro River, especially after
well,
the?
Yeah, I mean, well, they're going to take Odessa. Believe me, bro, they're going to take Odessa. That's a Russian city, historically, ethnically, and it's going to be liberated. And then they're going to move west from there. They're not going to leave any Ukrainian military or political power behind them when they start moving west.
So I think, I mean, there's definitely a desire to create a land bridge at this point between Transnistria and Russia. As far as, you know, the sort of like Russian tactical snafus and whatnot, you know, again, about a month ago, a lot of people were questioning the backing off of Kiev and Kharkov. And at this point, you know, there was speculation that, oh, well, it was diversional. They were trying to scatter the Ukrainian forces who were consolidated in Donbas. And at this point, it looks like that was true. It looks like that was true, and like that worked. I mean, as Russell said, Russia has taken a considerable amount of territory in the east and in the south. And I also don't remember the name of the guy, but I know what you're talking about. It's sort of been all over, this older gentleman who came on and kind of warned the Russian media that he thought they were in for some trouble. And as I recall, one of his major points was that when people are defending their homeland, they're very hard to defeat. And so this was one of the places that I thought his argument really didn't hold very much water, because look, the genesis of this conflict is people in Donbas defending their homeland against what they see as Western invaders. And I think this is why it's going as well as it. I mean, look, they held off the U.S. funded, U.S. trained, U.S. intelligence aided Ukrainian army for 8 years, with a pretty static front line the entire time without Russia's help. And going along that coast of the Black Sea there, whether you're in Mariupol or Melitopol, which are already liberated, or then going further into Nikolaev or Odessa, look, significant portions of that population are Russian speaking, ethnically Russian, and sympathetic to Russia. I think it's impossible to even know, while the current Kiev government still occupies these places, what the public opinion there is, because we've seen so much censorship, so much detainment of any opposition, of anyone who even blinks in the direction of Russia.
Right.
So
Right.
I think this is a miscalculation to say that these people are defending their homeland, because a lot of people, everyone on the other side, feels that they're defending their homeland in the same way.
Right.
But whether, look, when these huge shipments of U.S. weapons that come in, can that start to make a difference? I'm not enough of a military expert to know. That continues to be troubling, to see the flow of weapons that come in from the West. And every single, forgetting the military experts for a moment and forgetting the administrators and the governors and whatnot, when I was just speaking with grandmothers and just regular old civilians, who's a lady whose balcony had just been blown off by a grad, every single person said to me at some point when I interviewed them to tell the American people that they need to stop sending weapons to Ukraine, because this is what's fueling this conflict and what's continuing to kill people. And that, as an American citizen, and I assume a lot of our audience are also American citizens, this is the primary contradiction in this struggle for us. This is the thing that we need to put front and center, that our complicity in arming this fascist state is causing an incredible amount of needless death.
Well, here in Washington, we understand that the 40 billion that is being sold as Ukrainian aid to help Ukraine. That's the way the New York Times and the AP and Twitter in its news updates framed it. We understand that this is just a way of extracting money from the U.S. taxpayer to wash through Ukraine, and it's going to come right back here to the contractors, to the employees of the Beltway bandits and the arms dealers, the executives, the board members, people like Lloyd Austin, the Pentagon chief, who was a board member at, I believe, Lockheed. It's money laundering operation. Raytheon, sorry.
Yeah, he was
Raytheon. Okay, and Raytheon's the maker of the Javelin missile. Joe Biden was just down in Troy, Alabama, at the plant where Raytheon makes the Javelin missile, and he was, touting this kind of as a big plus for the U.S. economy. I mean, it was kind of a wink and a nod to military Keynesianism. So that's what this seems to be about. The Javelin missile did make a difference in areas like, this is my read of the Kiev Oblast and more built up areas, and it kind of might have made an even bigger difference in urban warfare. But in the eastern regions, in the Donbas, it looks to me like plains, and it seems to be much harder to get close to the tanks and to make a difference with a system like the Javelin. But beyond that, Russell, do you see any difference since the arms shipments have been arriving, and will this 40 billion change the calculus on the ground in any way, in your view?
Well, 30 of it will never, ever get here. The other 10, the more guns your enemies have, the more danger it is to go take them out. But I can tell you this, bro, I've already seen, the most dangerous weapon that I've seen the Americans send here so far was the M777 howitzer. And the United States sent 90 of them, and then other couple of NATO countries sent 10 between them. So there's 100 of them that got sent here. It's a very dangerous weapon. It's a long range, but I've seen already photographs. We've already captured one. I watched 3 or 4 of them get blown up today by missiles or aircraft. But the ones they've sent, the thing that makes the 777 dangerous is it has the ability to fire rocket-assisted artillery, which gives it a much longer range, and also GPS-guided artillery shells. but the cannons that I have seen photographs of from here in Ukraine don't have on the cannon itself the GPS guiding module. So really it's just more smoke and mirrors. It's, you know, it might as well be another, you know, just regular artillery cannons.
Right.
Now, the order said that they were going to send 145,000 shells for those 100 cannons. And that's a 152. That's a heavy duty shell, man. It'll make a hole in a road that you can park a couple of cars in. You know, it's the kind of shell that'll blow a whole house to pieces in one shot. You know, so it is a heavy weapon. It's, you know, it's long range. It's modern. It's much more modern than anything that the Ukrainians have so far. But again, they're you know, it's just like the NLAW missiles, the ones that the English sent, and the advantage of them was they could be fired from inside a room. If you fire like a LAW, an M72 anti-tank rocket, or an RPG-7, you can't shoot it inside of a hotel room because the backblast is so strong, it'll blow you to pieces. But the NLAW doesn't have the backblast, and so they considered it a weapon that can be used in urban warfare from inside of apartments. But the Ukrainian soldiers themselves were pointing out the fact that the NLAW anti-tank system has a 20-year shelf life. After 20 years, it either becomes unreliable or unstable. So it either won't work or else it'll blow you up when you try and fire it. And all the NLAW rockets that the British sent their good old Ukrainian comrades were 19 years old because it says on the rocket the date that it was made.
It's kind of like the
So
COVID jabs we sent to Africa.
Those aren't going to make any difference. As soon as the Russians came in, the outcome of this war was decided.
Right. And we've actually seen video. I don't know how commonplace this is, but we've seen video of NLAWs being fired from buildings on upper floors against Russian tanks, and the tanks and them failing to penetrate the tank's armor.
Yep. And I'll tell you something else, bro. We've captured hundreds, I mean, more than 1,000, I'm sure, and probably multi-thousands of them already.
So, one last question. We're coming up on 2 hours. Well, I got one or two more questions, but how have people's lives changed in Donetsk since the start of this military operation? Have they felt safer from the constant shelling they've experienced for the past 8 years? Have things changed culturally? I mean, I know on the other side of the so-called Grayzone, which was controlled by Ukraine, people were unable to learn in Russian in schools, for example. So what kind of changes have you both been witnessing on the ground there?
You want to take that one, Jim?
Well, I think in terms of Donetsk specifically, you know, you could take that best as someone who lives there. But more broadly, in Donbas in general, and in now some of Russian-controlled southern Ukraine, it depends. So I think in Donetsk, there's definitely unity and struggle amongst the people of Donbas, right? Up in St. Petersburg and Moscow, there is kind of this elite European educated kind of bohem bourgeoisie that can be a little anti-Z. But in the South, it's not that way. And I think that definitely got stronger with the Russian reinforcement behind. And instead of living in kind of an unknown, endlessly strung out scenario, it became, okay, this is a foregone conclusion. We're going to win this. In Lugansk, where the front line has been pushed back considerably, I think there's a lot more safety, a lot more normalcy that people are experiencing. And as I said, I mean, Russell wasn't on with us yet, but Melitopol was a really uh, was a really strong picture of how things have changed. You know, I said that it was the first victory parade in a very long time, um, and especially along the coast there, where there was a lot of economic activity historically. Um, well, and in Donbass in general with the mining, uh, Maidan came in and shut down the economy of really Ukraine at large, which is what happens when the West gets its hands on Eastern Europe in general.
Right.
You know, you can take a look at Moldova or Romania, who also thought that they would be like Germany if they got involved with Europe, and that hasn't panned out. But I think there's already an awful lot of hope, especially from that perspective. Because look, at the end of the day, this is what regular working people care about. They care about the material conditions of their own existence. Um, and I think people were seeing a really dead end economy and a state that really was run by oligarchs. Um, and now they see possibility of rebuilding some pride, and rebuilding some real infrastructure and recreating jobs and opening these. The mines of Donbass are legendary. Stakhanov is like sort of a real life Soviet John Henry, um, uh, who who worked in those mines out there. And of course the ports were, like I said, were a huge piece of the economy. And all of this was just eviscerated under Maidan. Um, so I think there's an awful lot of hope around that. And as the days pass, I mean, even a month ago, people in newly liberated areas were a lot more apprehensive, especially about speaking on camera, because I think that was one of the unfortunate pieces, even if it was strategically beneficial, uh, of the withdrawal from northern and western Ukraine in the beginning, that there were people there who actually were happy with the Russians coming, and they expressed this, and then Russia left, and they were, left at the mercy of the Ukrainians, and that's not a good situation. So I think, a month ago when I was sort of first in Donbass, people were much more apprehensive about talking, and then, by the last few days, people saw again, because the progress is going in that direction. Russia continues to gain territory. Um, People are much more willing to speak and say, "Hey, we actually see a future with Russia now," and that means that we might actually have a future at all, because 6 months ago it didn't look like it.
Russ.
Amen, brother. I'll say that in Donetsk, since the beginning of the year, the shelling has escalated and continued to escalate. And it's right now, it's at a level equal to when I first got here in 2014. It's very heavy, particularly in Petrovsky district where our home is. But people understand that this is, for the last 8 years, people, it's like the question that you ask each other instead of talking about the weather, waiting for the bus at the bus stop. You say, "Hey, when's this war going to end?" And, I've had kind of a semi-humorous answer when they ask me when the war's going to end. I say, "Hey, you know what? I know exactly when it's going to end." And they're like, "Oh, really? When?" And I'm like, "After our victory, Postli Pobiedo." And so and they think that's funny, but they know that it's true, because that is when it's, as long as there's Nazis, as long as there's Western control of Ukraine, there's going to be a war here, and there's going to be a threat to Russia. So after 8 long years of war, Operation Z is the beginning of the end of this war. And there's the famous saying, there's 2 famous sayings about Russians. And the first one is that they are slow to saddle their horse, but once they do, they ride very fast. And the second one is Russians don't start wars, they end them. And we're going to end this war in Kiev.
Well,
Yeah, I think
go
that's
ahead.
an important point too. That look, this denazification, it's not just a catchphrase, because the fact of the matter is that certain contingencies in Ukraine have taken on enough power that no amount of negotiations. Sorry, I dropped one of my headphones. As Russell said, the thing ends when we win, when they win. No amount of negotiations have proven worthwhile to this point. The Minsk agreements were violated constantly, every day. And this has to do with some of the Nazi contingencies and battalions who are officially a part of the Ukrainian armed forces, who, look, even if Zelensky was taken off the leash by the US and told them to cut it out, they wouldn't listen to him. So in the end, there's really, this is why the defeat at Azovstal is actually very important. And as the advance continues, I mean, I'm not sure how much of Western Ukraine needs to be advanced into or liberated for the thing to safely end. But I think it is really clear, and honestly, that I did an interview with a deputy of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation here in Petersburg, who have kind of a stronger line probably even than Putin on the conflict, which is that there needs to be regime change in Kiev, period. And there's no other way to resolve this. And that might be so, given the precedent that we've seen. So,
Yeah.
Absolutely, it's so.
Yeah. It's completely unclear from over here what the agenda is, but I cannot imagine that there will be some kind of Ukrainian rump state that will not continue to be pushed in the position of being a bulwark of NATO aggression. I just don't know how that ends, especially with the pressure on Finland and Sweden to join NATO, and neither of them are putting that to a referendum. They're just ramming it through, seemingly. It's only Turkey that seems to be holding it back. I mean, this is a moment NATO is trying to exploit. So it can only, in my view, lead to an intensification of the conflict and possibly a deepening of this war into, further west.
Well, this military war in Ukraine is just the opening salvo of the next part of the war, which will be even more important and dangerous than the military war here, which is going to be the economic war. And in fact, Russia's already winning that war too, hands down.
Yeah, the ruble is performing even better than at its pre-war value. That's for sure.
much better.
And Europe not looking good right now.
They're going to have a famine this year, bro.
Yeah. Do you want to address that? Either of you want to address that any further? There's a sort of a popular meme going around of all the EU states following the US.
Here's the point, bro. Last year, with the prices of gas, natural gas so high, fertilizer was not produced. Agricultural fertilizer production is a highly energy intensive industry. They couldn't afford to pay the price to produce the fertilizer. And even if they had been able to, the farmers wouldn't have been able to pay the price of buying the fertilizer that was produced at that price.
Right.
So the fertilizer simply wasn't produced. They don't have it. Right now is the spring planting season. They're not putting fertilizer on the earth right now, which means that their crop returns in the fall of this year, 2022, are going to be at 50% probably or less. And right now, Biden and Zelensky are trying to export all of the grain from Ukraine. 40 million tons, I believe, was the the number that was spoken, and they're bringing it out by railroad right now. But fortunately, Russia has blocked Odessa ports, so they can't bring it out by the shiploads. But they're engineering a real Holodomor in Ukraine, in Western, Nazi-controlled Ukraine. Russia has food security. Russia has enough fertilizer. They had a bumper crop last year. They're planting right now. They have energy security. They have economic security. They have military security. And that's the really big war. And that's where Putin proves his true genius as a warrior, is he's not just going to beat him in Ukraine. He's going to beat him worldwide. And he's going to beat him, like a yard dog. Believe me, Europe will be begging. They will be on their knees begging for help from Russia. And when Russia says you have to cut all ties, political, economic, military, with the United States before you get the first grain of wheat, they're going to say, okay, because if we don't, it's going to be like the French Revolution over the entire EU. And so Russia's going to cut them off at the toenails, bro. And I hope that the good people in the EU and the good people in the United States are able to survive. I hope they've prepared. But I saw a German economist, a real serious economist, predicting the other day that a loaf of bread could be 10 euros in Europe this year, before the end of this year.
Yep.
And that not everybody that had 10 euros to buy a loaf of bread there wouldn't be enough bread for all the guys that had 10 euros. And think how many people don't have 10 euros for one loaf of bread.
Well, it's the controlled demolition of the global economy we've been seeing for at least 2 years, accelerated, which leads people into a mindset believing that this is sort of intended, or it's actually being planned. I mean, certainly in the U.S., the LNG industry, the oil barons, the domestic producers here, this is a result. A deindustrialized Germany cut off from Russian gas is something they can live with. I mean, Germany's already trying to make plans for U.S. LNG. U.S. can make its own food. You just drive up the 5 highway in California and see what the U.S. can do. So we can ship food over there. So a deindustrialized, weakened Germany, I mean, that's definitely something the U.S. can live with. And that's Olaf Scholz's legacy right there. The weakening of the most powerful state in the EU in order to show resolve in the face of Putin. And I wonder how his population will react and how that will play out politically. My view is, you're going to see the far right, or what you call the populists in Europe, gain a lot of ground here thanks to these decisions. I don't know if either of you want to.
I don't know if it's going to be all that rosy in the United States this year.
Well, it's terrible here right now. It's terrible for real people.
Behind what's happening in Europe, man. But because whether or not the United States has a good agricultural harvest this year, the dollar's getting ready to go down.
The dollar is fucked.
It's getting ready to go down.
The stock market is going down. Crypto is, collapsing, I guess, for separate reasons, but it all feels like it's part of the same trajectory. And you have Biden blaming the Putin price hike. That's
Putin price hike.
And no one's accepting this. I mean, normal people aren't accepting it. The weirdos who live across the river from me on Capitol Hill, they've all got the Ukrainian flags. These freaks have Ukrainian flags. They're not even Ukrainian, and they're in front of their houses. I was actually out in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia a few days ago in a touristy area in Harper's Ferry. I'd never seen more Ukrainian flags. I thought I was like in a little quaint Ukrainian village or something. These are all rich liberals who are completely disconnected from what most Americans are saying, which is that inflation and prices are the biggest issue. And so if Biden wants to tell them there's a Putin price hike, well, I don't know if he's capable of running again, if he's going to be mentally cognizant in 2024, but he's going to get hammered by whatever right winger the Republicans put up.
Well, they'll both
Well, I think, look,
probably be
this is one of the.
But I'll tell you something. You know, the Ukraine flags flying all over Europe and the United States. These are just the next generation of the COVID mask. You know, this is virtue signaling of the idiots that when they thought it was a pandemic, they ran out and fought each other to buy toilet paper. You know, it's complete stupidity. These are peoples that are militantly ignorant. I mean, and they're so ignorant they're not really qualified to have an opinion, but yet they do, and they think they know everything, and they'll fight you over it if you say that you disagree.
Yeah. I actually, you know, took a picture. Maybe I'll tweet it, of one house, looked like a pretty wealthy person's place in Harper's Ferry, you know, which is obviously a nice place with a history of being the place where the civil rights movement was born, founded by W.E.B. Du Bois in honor of the raid staged by John Brown to liberate Black Americans from slavery. And there was a Ukrainian flag next to a Black Lives Matter flag. Actually, I saw this on several houses, and I thought nothing could be more indicative of the cognitive dissonance of affluent liberals than that. Considering what the Ukrainian flag represents in reality. And they think it represents something tolerant and democratic. So it also reminded me of like...
And meanwhile, we're now also invading Africa.
Represent the same thing, which is, you know, what do you call it? AstroTurfing, you know, true fascism.
Yeah. Well,
Ukrainians and Black Lives Matter are both the stooges and puppets of the 1%, you know, and the true enemies of humanity.
Well, Black Lives Matter now, its foundation is completely under the control of billionaires. What it may have represented years ago, you know, when it was about actually taking on police repression, was something different. But, you know, these operatives got in control of it. And, you know, Fergie, I'll go to your point on Africa in a second. But Russell, let me put this to you. The Black Lives Matter Foundation, which is, you know, controlled by billionaires, run by these neoliberal operatives, signed a letter along with 10 other billionaire-controlled foundations and organizations, Media Matters for America, demanding that another billionaire, Elon Musk, not be allowed to control Twitter because he would restore the accounts of people who were kicked off Twitter. In other words, he would roll back all of the censorship that was benefiting the neoliberals. So they're completely part of the agenda right now. And Russell, you have been completely removed from all social media platforms I can think of. That, I mean, your YouTube account was immediately nuked the day after, I think it was like 24 hours after Operation Z began. And for me, I mean, it was one of the best YouTube accounts. It's how I found you. And your video from the front when you were a member of the Novorossiya army, those were like watching, those were like watching action films. And your own story is fascinating. How you wound up in Donetsk, and it was a story you told there. I didn't see anything particularly threatening about it. There was no hate there. You weren't harassing anyone. You were just presenting a view of life that stood completely at odds with the kind that Nina Jankowicz and company want to project Clockwork Orange style into the consciousness of particularly young Americans. They've erected this great American firewall, and you were standing on the other side of it. Have you continued to be censored and attacked since then?
I mean, bro, all I have left right now is my Telegram, which is DPRTX, by the way, in case anybody wants to join me there, and my VKontakte, which is like the Russian Facebook, except without censorship and a much higher level of discourse and people. And I highly recommend anybody that isn't on both of those platforms to get on them, because it's like the final frontier against censorship. Dude, I got kicked off of Twitter in 2016.
Right.
You know, I mean, the only guy that I know that's more censored than me is Alex Jones.
Yeah, he was taken off every platform.
Me and him don't really get along all that well. I mean, though we're both from Austin, Texas, and we do have some things in common, but I'll have to say that he's been right about a lot more stuff than whatever people said that he was wrong about, you know. And I mean, but really, literally, he's the only guy that's been censored more than me.
Right. No, you're right.
Targeted by the BBC, Texas Monthly, Vice News, Newsweek, Rolling Stone. You know, they try and do hit pieces on me, but I still come out looking cool because what I'm doing is saying the truth, and I'm smarter than most of these journalists that they send out to try and make me look stupid.
Yeah, I mean, and they're just like Vice is the voice of normies now. I mean, it used to have this hipster veneer. Now it's just straight up normie propaganda. So, I mean, whether people agree with you or not, at least you're interesting and intriguing. I mean, none of these cats who write about you are. Rolling Stone, by the way, I mean, it's just a complete trash can of neocon propaganda on every issue. And its editor, Noah Shachtman, came from Wired magazine, which was actually basically a clearinghouse for intelligence propaganda, and was founded with seed money from the brother of John Negroponte, Nicholas Negroponte, through his CIA cutout at MIT. John Negroponte was the DNI and former leader of the death squads in Central America, presided over a disgusting torture program of Guatemalans. But I mean, since we're talking about U.S. empire, Fergie, you wanted to make a point about, Biden now invading Africa.
Yeah, I was going to talk
Reinvading Africa.
Yeah, I also, just to backtrack really quickly, I think it's, and you touched on this, but I think it's a really important clarification to make. If we're talking about opposing ruling class power in the U.S., that there is a huge difference between a lot of the people who came out for the spontaneous moments around the George Floyd shooting, around Michael Brown's extrajudicial murder, around all of these police murders, than there is between Black Lives Matter National, the foundation that, like, just about every other progressive outfit in the U.S. and every other quote unquote left NGO in the U.S. it exists to contain real revolutionary movement in the United States. So I just want to put that out there as somebody who did a lot of work with the anti-police violence movement, that there are people who came out of what maybe they even considered and called the Black Lives Matter movement, who are doing really serious work and who are doing anti-imperialist work in this moment. So we really just need to make sure that distinction is really strong. And then
I mean, the frontliners from Ferguson would openly condemned all of these frauds that have taken over Black Lives Matter.
For sure.
What was happening in New York around Eric Garland was completely different from what took place in late 2020. It wasn't even about the cops anymore. It was, to me, it just looked like security state theater, strategy of tension, and the Proud Boys and whatever the hell was taking place in Portland. To me, they just looked like the gangs of New York, both like street gangs for crazy. Rival political parties.
Just unorganized nonsense. Well, and even New York in 2020, there were some contingencies in the very early George Floyd response that were being real about it. And then very quickly, it turned into bicycle vigils led by white liberal college students from Pratt, walking around Brooklyn. But anyway, look, I think us going into, I'm originally from Brooklyn, so the vitriol that I have for the post-millennial Brooklyn yuppie is pretty strong. But us going now into Somalia, right? Biden has announced that we're sending, he's undoing Trump's withdrawal of troops from Somalia, which is just an extension of an incredible and very quiet presence that we have in Africa. AFRICOM, the U.S. command in Africa, grew exponentially under Obama, which was a very convenient front for the State Department to use, that we had a black president. So just like Zelensky's Jewish, so there's no Nazis in Ukraine, Obama was black, so we couldn't possibly be colonizing Africa.
Right.
I think it's indicative of a larger overall trend that goes back to this economic question that we asked before, which is that, look, conditions are deteriorating in the West all over the place. It's more obvious in Europe that, the gas is out of control. I think people here in Russia panicked for about a week or two when the sanctions started, and now it's fine. Prices really haven't gone up. The ruble is behaving strongly, as Russell said. They are mostly self-sufficient here. Meanwhile, out west, yeah, there are weapons profits coming, and there are going to be some people in the gas companies that are really happy that the Nord Stream pipeline didn't go through in Germany. But working people and regular people in the U.S. On all sides of this sort of, look, left and right are sort of dead terms in the U.S. Because of the power of political propaganda. There are working regular people all over the place. Some of them are represented by the sort of European by heritage white working class, and some of them are the descendants of slaves and immigrants, many of whom came from countries terrorized by the U.S. And as you said, the liberal elites who really do run the show, whether they vote Democrat or Republican or whatever the hell it is, they might be in Arlington, Virginia, they might be in Manhattan, they might be in Beacon Hill in Boston, but they're completely divorced from any sort of real connection with working people in the U.S. And the typical response of a capitalist imperialist society to these kinds of deteriorating social conditions is to get closer and closer to fascism and to try to build more war around the world. And when we see Biden creating a Department of Disinformation, that's a branch, a Bureau of Disinformation, sorry, that's a branch of the Department of Homeland Security. And then we see an expansion of war in Africa, and we see billions and billions and billions more going to Ukraine. Look, we can't help but, I can't help but be afraid. I mean, shit, I'm going back to the U.S. pretty soon for a little bit, and I don't know what's going to happen when I get to JFK, at this point. I mean, I'm honestly sort of afraid of what may be in the works for anybody who dares counter the prevailing narratives of the ruling class in the U.S. But at the same time, I think there are enough people who are savvy that look, I mean, the hot new trend hits the social media world, whether it was Ukraine or COVID or whether it was Will Smith or Johnny Depp. But then people really do start to ask questions. They start to wonder, well, wait, why is there so much inflation here, and food prices are going up and gas prices are going up, and we don't have healthcare and we don't have public universities, and we're sending, by this point, more money to Ukraine than Russia spends on its entire military in a year. And it's happening in Europe too, especially in Southern Europe, which is always really weary of the hands in Berlin, Brussels, and DC. So look, there's a mounting political crisis, which of course means more potential for real revolutionary movement in the West and more potential for fascist consolidation in the ruling class. This is how history develops, and it's sort of terrifying, and at the same time, it could open the door for some positive developments in the West.
Right. Well, the one positive development we've seen is a poll showing over 50% of Americans would support an independent candidate who is not Joe Biden or Donald Trump. I think more and more people are just getting fed up, getting out of the paradigm, and there is room for independent candidates bringing together a broad anti-establishment coalition. And I think, I don't want to go too in detail, but both parties are trying to kind of do everything they can to co-opt and suppress that energy. I want to address a little Grayzone business, but first, Russell, if there's anything you want to say before we go and help people find your Telegram channel.
Okay, yeah, it's I saw in the comments there some people. It's TX DPR, or no, excuse me, DPR TX. or if you just look for Russell, Texas, Bentley, I got a personal channel. I got my own like channel and plus a chat channel. And believe me, and I'm getting used to Telegram. I have, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 followers on Telegram now. But the contact is the place for people to go. That is my main platform now. It's like Russian Facebook without the idiots and without the censorship. And believe me, it's worth the effort to get onto it. The contact, VK. It's Russian Facebook. I highly recommend everybody do it. And then all you have to do is get like a translate add-on on your browser, and then everything's in English, and it becomes most interesting and most easy to communicate with people. And there's hundreds of thousands. There's multi-millions of people from the West who are coming to VK because they're tired of the low quality of discourse and the censorship on Facebook. VContact is where to go. Russell Bentley, there's not very many of them on there. Just look for the one with my handsome face. It'll probably be me.
He's hard to miss.
Yeah, you're hard to miss. I mean,
and if I may say one other thing too, that the Human Aid Fund that I founded back in 2015, that's based in the United States. It's a 501c3 registered charity. Although I have resigned and distanced myself from it because of the political repercussions that they would have if they were still connected or identified with me, it is still a 100% excellent fund to support. You're helping children, mainly children, and victims of the war in Donbas. It's completely legit, completely legal. It's completely, all the money is accounted for, open accounting. Every penny is explained when it comes in and what it went out for. And that's Donbas Humanitarian Aid. If you look up on Google, even still, it's like the first one that comes up on the search. Just go Donbas Humanitarian Aid. It's based in Florida. It's a legit 501c3 charity. And every dollar that you send to them gets spent on helping the victims of this war.
all right. Well, thank you so much for the info about where people can find you. I mean, we found you on, we're talking by phone. So that's what I'm going to keep. That's what I'm going to keep doing here. They're gunning for us. And I wanted to address that really quickly.
Bro, every dollar of the truth is more powerful than $1 million of their bullshit.
Yep. I mean, and
so they're scared of us.
They're scared of us. And, our live streams are doing better than, videos that you see on YouTube from MSNBC, which has millions of subscribers. Same with Jimmy Dore. I'll be on Jimmy at 7 Eastern time tonight, addressing the calls to actually imprison people. We're hearing, we've heard this from MSNBC pundits, to imprison people for what they call misinformation, which is any information or opinion that contravenes the objectives of the neoliberal establishment and the national security state. We're seeing, as the disinformation board collapses because of the insanity of weird Nina Jankovic, that there's calls for more intense measures to crack down on speech. The Daily Beast sent some little snitch to contact our Patreon and to contact YouTube to call for the Grayzone to be removed on the grounds that he didn't like our opinions on U.S. empire or many of the other psyops that are constantly being rammed down our throats. We saw calls from Nina Jankowicz herself for us to be censored. I remember about 2 weeks ago, I couldn't even keep track of the articles about us being part of some kind of vast, Russian disinformation complex. We have no connection with the Russian state at all. Paul Mason, the British Trotskyist, wrote a piece in the New Statesman calling for state action against the Grayzone, singling me and Aaron Mate out. And this is happening to so many other people. We can't even keep track of the, people who are putting forward the same critical point of view who've been censored. So we're going to stay and fight. We're not going to leave Patreon. We're not going to leave YouTube for some alternative, although I am on Rockfin and I do exclusive content on Rockfin, and we discuss issues that you just simply can't discuss on YouTube. And we're just going to stay there. And if they ban us from every platform, I'm going to be handing out paper editions of the Grayzone in Washington, D.C. at intersections. I'm going to be handing them out for free. I will set up newspaper boxes. I swear to God that will happen. And we're going to stay here and we're going to fight, because I know that that censorship agenda is indicative of the desperation of a discredited elite that sees the American people as their real enemy, not Putin. They see the American people as their true enemy. And that's who they fear.
American people understand that Putin is not their enemy. It's their parasite class, their oligarchs, and their, would-be masters.
So we're looking
I come from that class, and they are terrified of the people. They are terrified of them. Yeah.
I don't know. Do you want to add an anecdote before you go?
On that, I don't think I should.
Okay. Well, hopefully, we can meet in person and swap stories. We know each other through mutual friends down in Atlanta in activist circles. So I'm glad we got to meet here virtually, and we're looking forward to receiving you back at JFK's interrogation room. I should tell you, we've covered this at the Grayzone. We've had friends who were interrogated, and basically what they do is they take your phone and they won't let you have it back for 30 days, and they do whatever they want with it if you refuse to let them go into it in person. You have no legal rights when you are in that room. And that's according to federal US law, or at least whatever the DHS asserts. So be prepared with your devices is my advice. Maybe become deviceless. Although the reality is we don't have anything to hide, and everything, speaking for ourselves at the Grayzone, everything we do is public. So bring it on.
And, I want to say thank you to both of you guys. You guys, I'm proud to call you friends and comrades. And I hope that you two meet in the very near future. And I think all three of us will meet in the not too distant future after Russia denazifies Ukraine with Operation Z. Maybe we'll take care of Europe, and then we'll come across the Atlantic for Operation A.
Yeah. Well, I'll see you in the dirty South in Donbas again fairly soon, Russell.
All right, bro.
And maybe they'll let me into the U.S. And if you want to follow any of my social, every platform. I'm the same name. I'm JCC Fergie, like this, on Telegram, Instagram, Twitter.
Let me get that on.
All of the above. So yeah, that's pretty much any platform. And I have a Substack blog and have written articles for a couple journals. But that's all posted on the socials. So, at the end of the day, look, there are a lot of stories around the world that people need to listen to more, that the West has blacked out. But of course, what is truly a worldwide economic, cultural, and military war is right now at its hottest in Donbas, and so I'm really grateful that you had both of us on, as you have before. You've shed light on this issue, but people need to understand this because it's crucial to understanding the conflict in general. So thanks for letting us talk about it.
All right. Fergie, Russell, thanks a lot. We'll have you all back on because this is going to continue. And
Thanks, Max. I'll get my Wi-Fi issues straightened out in the next couple of weeks, I hope. And dude, when we come back, we'll be bigger and better than ever. Both of you guys are real serious heroes, and it takes one to know one. And max respect and glad to be comrades with you, boys.
much respect.
Stay safe.
Stay safe out there. And thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks everyone for joining. And we'll be back next week or maybe even later this week with more guests that you might not see in many other places in Western media. And, you know, as long as we're here, we're just going to keep fighting to tell the truth. And 2 other quick pieces of Grayzone business. We do have a piece coming out on Somalia soon on the site by TJ Coles, who is a real resource on Africa, on the history, politics, and the military interventionism of the U.S. in Africa. So look for that and look for a follow-up to Kit Clarenberg's explosive piece relying on tranche of leaked emails exposing Operation Surprise about an intelligence cabal in the UK that has been manipulating the entire Brexit process and may be responsible for installing Boris Johnson at number 10. This piece is backed up with the hardest evidence possible, and I'm pretty confident as the ball continues rolling that the British mainstream press is going to have to pick up on this and that this will eventually turn into a national scandal. I mean, this is once in a generation reporting, as former British Ambassador Craig Murray said, and we're just going to keep doing it. So follow the grayzone.com and I'll be back here pretty soon. Peace.